Okay, so the discussion we're going to have today is your article, which probably put up on your website 2 weeks ago, was it?
Yeah, week and a half, 2 weeks.
Week and a half, about whether we could expect inflation happening. There being a fear in the policy among economic policymakers that you create too much money, it'll create hyperinflation. So we're going to talk about inflation, but I think it might be useful to just clarify what we're talking about when we're talking about inflation. And I mean, in your article, for example, you mentioned the German hyperinflation after World War I. Now that is hyperinflation, where the price level goes up so much and so rapidly that people, in order to buy anything, need a wheelbarrow full of banknotes. And that's a little bit different from where prices are going up, not nearly as fast as that, over months and years, which is, I think, the situation in this country over the last few years. You agree with that? I think that it's important to clarify that. The thing about the German hyperinflation of after World War I was, in your article, you talk about it as being considered a potential reason why political extremism and social conflict was rife in Germany, as well as unemployment later after the Great Depression. But that's not, whereas you can see that as a potential reason for political instability, that's not exactly the same as what we're talking about now. But do you think that policymakers actually fear a hyperinflation like World War I?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we see inflation on a continuum, so there's almost normal day-to-day inflation, which it doesn't exist in every society always, but in modern, in the modern economy, you have a rolling inflation rate of about 2%, give or take a percent, and everyone's happy with that because it's sort of eroding some of the interest that we need to repay on debt. So there's this idea amongst central bankers that you can kind of stabilize inflation around about 2%, and that makes everyone happy. The big fear at the other end of the spectrum is the kind of hyperinflation that you get in Weimar Germany, or more recently in Zimbabwe, where as fast as governments are printing currency, so people are spending it and driving prices up still further, until in effect the currency has no value. At that point, people resort to bartering things rather than bothering with the currency because nobody wants to take the currency from them. I think Germany in particular, the German banking system even today is wary of inflation because of that experience. That 1924 was also the year where Hitler attempted the Munich Putsch. So I think to Germans far more than the rest of the developed world, the link between inflation, economic mismanagement, and political extremism is far greater. So one of the sort of closer to home things that we see as a result of that is the Germans' refusal to bail out Greece and the other southern European countries in 2011. Because the German fear is that if we print a load of euros to give them to the Greeks and the Spanish and the Portuguese, that is going to send inflation rife across Europe, and that will destroy Europe. So even though the austerity program that they imposed on Greece, everybody knew it wouldn't work, that you can't cut your way to prosperity. Even though that, the German bankers insisted on it anyway. A less up-to-date example, but one that gets closer to home in the UK, was that one of the reasons behind Black Wednesday in 1992-93 was that the German bankers refused to uphold the rules of the exchange rate mechanism, effectively by printing Deutschmarks to keep Britain in the mechanism. Essentially, when it came to a choice between the European mechanism or inflation, they chose to fight inflation, or at the expense of the European mechanism. That threw Britain into a crisis. It effectively did for the last Tory administration under John Major, paved the way for Blair to come in. So it really affected modern British political history. There is an argument that had Major not had to face that crisis in 1992, that Tory government might have gone on to win the ensuing election in 97 as well, or at least that Blair wouldn't have got in with the massive majority that he did. So these things have real effects that kind of echo down the years.
Yeah, you and I studied economics at different times. I think it was late 80s, early 90s, and me late 60s, early 70s. And when I was a student, inflation was generally conceived of as a problem which arose because the trade unions were too powerful because of full employment. And it was a problem that you got, inflation was a problem you got when the economy, to use the jargon words, was overheating because it was too close to full employment and you were trying to get too much out of the economy, more than the capacity of the economy could produce. And then, so it was like the Achilles heel of Keynesian economics. And at that time, the assumption of everybody in the economics department, everybody I can remember anyway, was that Keynesian economics was the way in which you managed an economy which was growing perpetually and would always grow perpetually from now to infinity. And of course, what happened immediately I'd finished my economic training, the economy stopped growing perpetually and hit the energy crisis of the 1970s, which was partly the result of the political situation in the Middle East with OPEC and Israel and so on, but was also partly the result of peak oil in the United States, at least south of Alaska. So something happened that the model that we were all trained to regard as something which would stay with us forever suddenly didn't work in the same way anymore. I think one of the things that we're looking at here is this issue of these models that you're trained in, and then suddenly they actually don't figure. I wonder if you...
Yeah, so I go back to somewhere around about the 1550s. And from there right up to 1973 or up to the late 70s, we have a model of economic crises that is all about demand. Marx gets to this where he talks about a crisis of overproduction, although I think what he's actually talking about is a crisis of underconsumption. That basically, as wealth is accumulating to the people at the very top, there's less wealth to go round at the bottom, so that the workers cannot buy back the goods that they've created. Now, as a result, the capitalists can't sell the products that they've made. We go into a slump. Eventually, you have a lot of what the neoclassical economists would call creative destruction, where effectively the weakest companies go bankrupt, the weakest workers get laid off. Eventually, the demand for labor comes back and we start a new cycle. What Keynes is trying to do is to say, look, let's make the government the investor of last resort. So when all of the other investors are refusing to put money into the economy because there isn't demand in the economy, what the government should do is step in and, if necessary, create not real jobs for people to do. And you have this idea that it's better to pay somebody to dig a hole and then fill it back in again than to leave that person idle and not pay them. And the thinking is, if they've got money, they will then go out and buy things that will take up the slack in the economy. Investors will then see that there's growth in the economy, so it's worth investing. And so it goes on. Now, what we hadn't had to face at any time, over several hundred years, was a resource depletion. We came close to it really around the time of the First World War as coal started. But by then you have oil coming in, particularly in the USA, to replace it. In the 70s, what we get is this oil deficit. And it's basically the Americans, they have an organization called the Texas Railroad Commission that acts as a monopoly for the global oil price. And between the war and 1970, they set the oil price roughly $20 to $25 per barrel in today's money. So you have this long period of stability where everyone can count on that there will be enough oil for whatever you want to do, and the price will be relatively stable. In 1970, they lose control of that because they can no longer expand production in order to bring prices back down if demand goes up. At that point, and it feeds into the currency crisis that America has at the time, where the dollar is inflating, and because the dollar is the gold standard, effectively America is exporting its inflation to Europe and to Japan. So around the same time, the European countries start saying, look, we don't want to be paid in dollars anymore, pay us in gold. So you get this spectacle for a few years of armed destroyers ferrying gold from Fort Knox across to Europe. And of course, Nixon realizes this can't go on, eventually takes the dollar off the gold standard, everyone is thrown into a crisis, but it re-exports the inflation away from America back to Europe. So that Europe then is facing a currency problem. At the same time, you get the Arab-Israeli war going on, you get that boycott. So we actually see genuine shortages of oil. That there are queues of cars at the filling stations. You're only allowed to buy perhaps a gallon of petrol at most. People are faced for the first time with this demand side shock. In such circumstances, the prevailing government model that you print money in order to get yourself out of the crisis simply doesn't work. That when you have a shortage of a key commodity, then it doesn't matter how much currency you print, you cannot magic that commodity into existence. So that we go through, and in large part, the inflation that we see in the 70s, although it's blamed on the dollar shock, is actually to do with the oil shock. The oil shock gets almost written out of the history. We then get all of the stuff, the political stuff about, it's greedy trade unions that are holding the country to ransom. Actually, most working people across that period didn't get pay rises. There were a handful of strategic industries like the coal mines, the steel works, the docks, that were able to command pay rises. But when you get to the winter of discontent in 1978, that's almost a revolt of the mass of the working people who've never been able to force pay rises onto government. So if you remember at the time, they set this 5% limit on pay increases. The point was it was a limit. And if you were in one of the sort of less well-organized or less powerful unions, you didn't even get the 5%. But at the same time, inflation is running at 15, 20, 25%. So that your living standard is being massively eroded. At the same time, you're looking at newspapers and television channels telling you that it's all the fault of the unions.
Yes.
And you're starting to think, well, what's my union doing? Yes, of course, 1978, it's all of the poorer workers, the grave diggers, the refuse collectors, low-grade office workers. They are the ones that come out. And we get all of those lovely pictures of refuse piling up on the side of the streets, and kind of, which again played into Thatcher's hands politically. But by then, the idea that this is about oil had been written out. Because the reason it comes back in the end is because you get the second shock, which is the Iraq-Iran war, which leads to further oil shortages, which drives prices up again. What that does is allows the North Sea to come into production. It allows the North Alaskan Slope in the US to come into production. So you get the opening up of more expensive oil fields that can be brought online. That gets rid of the demand shock, that there is now oil to go round, albeit at a much higher price. And under OPEC, it sort of stabilizes, not as stable as the Texas Railroad Commission got it, but you get a stabilizing the price around about $40 a barrel. And that is just about enough that companies can be profitable, workers can be paid, and the oil industry can keep turning a profit. So we get another, decade or so of further growth before global oil peaks. which is 2005. Because that then triggers us into the downward spiral that gets us to the 2008 crisis and everything that's come since. Now, all of those are explainable in terms of oil, far less explainable in terms of greedy trade unions.
Yeah, well, exactly. But what I chiefly remember about my own thinking and the thinking of other people at that time was how little we kind of re-theorized, virtually non-existent re-theorization of what was actually happening in economic terms, and how little energy. Obviously, we were aware of these energy crises, but we weren't aware to the extent that we re-theorized the nature of economics itself and put energy at the heart of economics, which is extraordinary when you consider that once the North Sea oil started to come onshore in the UK, it completely transformed the nature of the economic situation in Britain. What happened was that those changes were attributed as successes of Thatcherist economics. It's extraordinary that things which had absolutely nothing to do with the success of policymakers were attributed to these policymakers when they were actually the result of oil coming on shore and completely changing the nature of the British economy. So they became a petro economy with a very, very strong currency, because obviously if you wanted to buy North Sea oil from the UK sector, you would want sterling. So you demand sterling, and the price of sterling would go up, and it would be a strong currency. That in turn completely changed the situation for the City of London, which had been in a situation of decline up until that point, and enabled the City of London to kind of rebirth itself as a haven for financial institutions and criminals as well, all the way around the world.
It's the one part of the British Empire that never went away, where all of those islands dotted around the world where we can offshore tax for tax reasons. You offshore money in such a way nobody can find it. So you have the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, the Virgin Islands, even Jersey and the Isle of Man closer to home. The oddity was the Falkland Islands apparently wasn't somewhere that they put money, but they went and fought a war over it anyway. But all of the other islands, there's this sort of network. There's a film called The Spider's Web. It's this idea of a web emanating from the City of London that is effectively a money launderer to the world's criminal classes. Sort of Putin's oligarchs are all in there, the Chinese bureaucrats, the Arab oil sheikhs. They are all laundering dirty money through the City of London via the network of tax havens in such a way that what was dirty money going in appears to be clean money coming out. You have sort of secrecy laws that make Swiss bankers blush. That you just cannot find out who owns various pots of money. Britain effectively used oil to prop up its currency, and then used the currency and its access to dollars as and effectively it created euro dollars, then after 1973 converted them to petrodollars. The idea was that there were all of these crooked people, including sort of prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, any country that was part of that Soviet empire, who needed to trade with the world in dollars, but daren't put their dollars somewhere inside America, because they were always at risk of an American government sanctioning them and taking their money off them. So instead, Britain acts as this sort of go-between and says, well, look, we will supply you with euro dollars initially, then petrodollars. And basically, you won't be at risk of the Americans commandeering your money and closing your accounts. That you'll be able to carry on trading with the world quite freely, no questions asked. And of course, our bankers will take their percentage cut of all of the transactions. So Britain becomes in part an oil state, in part a sort of money laundering state. The problem is that the wider economy beyond that continues to slump. that if you're a British business and you're trying to export to the world, the pound is now so strong that you just can't compete.
Mm.
Now, under Thatcher, we saw that with this massive decimation of British industry, where something like 2 million jobs disappeared within the space of about 3 years. The unemployment fell once the oil came on shore, but that wasn't because they created new jobs. It's because they found lots of creative ways of hiding unemployment. So one of the classics was they developed effectively early retirement, where they created a benefit called incapacity benefit, where as long as you were over 50 and you could persuade your doctor to sign a sick note, instead of getting unemployment benefit, you were given this incapacity benefit at, I think it was about half as much again as being unemployed. So there was that advantage to it. Plus, you didn't get hassled to go and find a job or anything. You were allowed to do your own thing. If you had a private pension, you were allowed to use that to supplement the benefit. So that a large number, it would have been the pre-baby boom generation, were able to retire early on generous state benefits that were almost as good as the state pension. And as long as they could keep persuading their doctor to sign sick notes, nobody was questioning it. It suited everyone that was involved. As a government got to hide millions of unemployed people by effectively retiring them early, but not saying so. Various other enterprise schemes were created where you could claim that somebody that was in training paid for by the state was no longer unemployed. But eventually the university system itself becomes that rather than having young people leave school and become unemployed, let's get them to take out a big loan and go off to university and we'll hide them there. No expectation that they're going to get degree level jobs when they come out.
Oh, well, I think there was an expectation. It's just that the expectation is progressively less and less realistic. But yeah, I mean, all that could only last as long as the oil lasted. And that started to fall in 1999. And I think we've talked about it before. Was it in 2005? Britain became a net importer of oil and gas. Was it both in the same year?
I think it was oil peaked in 2004, then gas peaked. Oil, we became a net oil importer in 2004, a net gas importer in 2005. By then, North Sea production had slumped by more than 60% from its 1999 peak. So this is just 5 years, and we've seen this massive decline in the amount of oil being extracted from the North Sea. I mean, at its peak in the mid to late 80s, the North Sea was producing as much oil as Kuwait. We were right out there pumping it and selling it to the world. And it was bringing in a huge income to government and to the businesses involved. The problem is, unlike, say, Saudi Arabia or Norway, where they at least looked at sovereign wealth funds, Britain made no attempt to think through what are we going to do when the oil runs out. So for our political class, they worked on the assumption that oil was infinite. And you didn't have to worry because if one oil field in the North Sea dried up, well, we'll find another one. And of course, geology doesn't work that way. Add to that we did what everybody else does, and we went for the easiest deposits first. So you have the massive Forties field, which is the biggest field that they've ever drilled. Now we're sort of chasing fields that are basically in oil terms, any oil field that somebody announces that has less than 1 billion barrels in it is barely worth drilling. The oil industry requires big numbers. So 1 billion barrels of oil to us sounds huge. To the oil industry, that's a couple of years worth of drilling. We are now in the North Sea and beyond now out into the Atlantic. The British industry is talking about drilling thousands of barrels out of the ground. It is almost getting to the point of saying, look, we've found somebody's garden shed and it's still got a couple of cans of oil in it. Not quite that bad, but it's moving in that direction. That what Britain no longer has is an oil industry that is capable of providing the foundation for an economy.
Well, I think that it's difficult to understate, is that the right word I'm looking for? It's difficult to get a grasp, anyway, on the scale of the crisis that's coming down as a result of this. Because, you know, when I was a student, at the end of 20 years after World War II, Britain lost an empire, but up until that point, it had a fantastically large world empire. And in the 50s and 60s, it still did think of itself as a very important place, junior partner for America and all the rest of it. And then all that seemed to be going down the pan in the 1970s. And then North Sea oil rescued it. And it was possible to regrow this financial empire as well as the oil. And it kind of put off the day of reckoning for British society and its historical world empire until now, basically, until the North Sea oil disappeared. It was just the last gasp, but people didn't realize this. And all sorts of politics have been based on this idea that Britain's this particular special place where it no longer is this in the world. But anyway, let's get back to your back of inflation and finance. What does all this say, though, about the prospects for the finance sector in the City of London? And the reason I say all this is that, you know, you can think about inflation and unemployment and so on, but ultimately it's the prospects for the finance sector as a major part of the British economy. And there are a lot of left-wing economists who still don't understand the importance of energy, but they see finance capitalism as replacing industrial capitalism as a sort of parasitical growth on productive kind of capitalism, the kind of capitalism that has factories and makes stuff. Whereas the finance capitalism is parasitical. Finance, insurance, real estate, and so on is essentially about extracting rents and getting money by its parasitical relationship on people, on companies, and so on, money lending, and not actually investing the money in anything productive at all.
I mean, one of the things, if you look at how energy ties to this, that there's a kind of paradox with oil pricing. So if you like, the basic assumption had been, and we see this in the 1970s, that if oil is in short supply, then the price of oil rises. As the price of oil rises, we get the opening up of new oil fields. That stabilizes the prices again, and off we go. Now, the paradox comes because we reach a point where, and it's largely because we drill the easiest oil fields first and move on to the more difficult ones. So what's happening over time is that the cost of getting the oil out of the ground keeps going up. We reach a point, because the expectation was after 2008 that the price of oil was just going to go up and up and up into the stratosphere. At one point, it reached nearly $150 a barrel. And you were starting to see prices at the pumps for petrol and diesel getting to prices where people were really starting to get upset about it. Everyone thought at that point that, well, yeah, this is the way the future will be, that the price of oil will just keep going up and up, price of fuel will keep going up, and it will continue forever. The paradox was that you reached this point, and we got there sometime around 2008, where the price is too high for consumers collectively to afford, but at the same time, it's too low for producers to keep producing. So whereas in 1979, if you were an oil company and basically you had your reserves of oil that were sort of untapped fields, you were able to say, well, look, you know, now the price has gone up, we can go and drill these fields. Fast forward to today, there are very few places around the world where oil companies are saying, oh, look, you know, we can open up these new big fields and get going again. You have financial manipulation in the US, which causes the fracking industry to go for, I mean, that's probably now behind us, but that went for about 10 years. That was more about the financial sector desperately looking to raise its income. So ordinarily, the financial sector would get its money by investing in things and then taking a cut of the profits. By 2008, you've got whole classes of investors who are facing, in practice, 0% interest. That by the time you've factored what inflation there is into the equation, basically all you're doing by investing your money in conventional areas like government bonds is you're not losing money to inflation, but you're not gaining anything. So if you're an insurance company or a pension fund and you've got a business model based on at least 5% returns, some of them closer to 10, you desperately need to find somewhere that's offering a high rate of return. One of the places that is the fracking industry. So they're promising you that this new miracle technology that we've got that's going to, we're going to become Saudi America, we're going to have 100 years of energy independence. Okay, you want to get in there quick because you want that big return. So effectively, investors across the world have put money into a fracking industry that's invested billions of dollars in extracting millions of dollars worth of oil. And one of the things very quietly during the pandemic that's been going on is they've all been going out of business because it never was profitable. Fracking produces very small amounts of oil. It's very often the wrong kind of oil. It's ultra light. It's closer to the stuff that you put in a cigarette lighter than to what we would think of as crude oil. So for all sorts of reasons, that was never going to happen. But it was one of these financial manias that pop up now and again that people end up throwing money away on. The problem we have now is that there are very few places where you can actually make any money at all in financial terms. Nobody wants to invest in the real economy because the real economy is bankrupt. Basically, if you're investing in things that are making a loss because people can't afford to buy them collectively. At the same time, the number of places where you can put money and still make money is almost like people being corralled into a handful of asset classes. And this is to do with who gets the money. I mean, Keynes talked about paying the guy at the bottom of the income level money to go dig a hole and then fill it up again. The current system doesn't provide money to the guy at the bottom of the ladder. It provides money to the ones at the top on this ridiculous idea that it will trickle down. Because the problem is it doesn't trickle down. These people desperately try to park it somewhere. So corporations that do it, one of their big things over the last decade or so has been to buy back their own shares. Because when a company issues a share, that's effectively a form of debt. That basically it is offering to pay you a dividend instead of interest, but it's the same thing. So if that company can get quantitative easing money at 0% interest and then use it to buy back the existing debt, that's good for the company. They've got rid of their interest payments. It also, on paper, looks like the company is more valuable because there are fewer shares to go around, and the people that are investing are sort of corralled into buying them. So the price of shares is driven up, but the company is in reality no more valuable than it was. It's just priced that way. So if you're an institutional investor where your business model insists that you invest a proportion in shares, you have no choice but to buy from this shrinking pool of shares. So the money gets in there because the irony is that we don't count rising stock markets or rising demand for government bonds as part of inflation. The things we count as inflation are things like iPads, computers, televisions, and actually they're the things that people are less and less able to afford to buy. So the paradox has been over the last few years that the central banks want inflation to go up. Inflation has been below that 2% mark that they've wanted for quite some time. However, because we don't have collectively enough cash to buy everything, the reality is that the price keeps going down. So in a sense, part of what I was writing about was pointing out that, if you like, the reason inflation doesn't exist is because we're looking in the wrong place. And that there is actually plenty of inflation if you look at where people at the very top are putting their money. So collectibles, jewelry, fine art, all of those are exploding in price. Whereas if you want to go out and buy an iPad, it probably costs you pretty much the same now as it did 5 years ago.
They're exploding in price because people who are wealthy are desperate to find places to park their wealth that will retain their wealth. But can I just return, because I think it is incredibly important, to a point that you made just then, a little bit back, when it's kind of economics 101. It's one of the first things you learn when you're doing economics at O level or A level or whatever, or degree level, is this idea of the price mechanism. That the price mechanism and markets will sort things out, because if there's a shortage of a good, essentially its price will go up and it'll become more profitable to produce. And as a result of it becoming more profitable to produce, people will put resources into setting up factories or production systems to make it. Or if it's oil, if its price goes up, it'll become more profitable to produce it or go out and look for it. And so you get more of it. That's the supposed magic of the market economy. What we're talking about here is something fundamentally, how should I put it, unexpected for most economists and for most people who have this very simplistic view of how things work. And that is that you can get a situation where it stops becoming profitable to make things or to extract things, because, and it's particularly true where natural resources are involved because of depletion, that it becomes more and more costly to produce or extract oil or other resources because you're running out of them. So you're having to use the deposits in more out of the way and difficult to get at places, so that the costs of production or extraction rises, and eventually you reach a place where the cost is so high that people in the mainstream economy cannot afford to pay that. And so the oil industry, or indeed it applies to other natural resources and so on, cannot afford to pay the price, and the industry itself goes bust, which is, as you described, what's been happening to the fracking industry. And this is the sign, it seems to me, that an economy is at the end of the road when its energy source, the industry associated with its energy source starts going bankrupt, which is what is happening to the energy sector and to a variety of mining and other resource extraction industries. The cost of actually extraction of the resources is not any longer affordable for the mainstream economy. And if that's the case, then means that more and more economic sectors must crash, must go out of business. It's the reverse process to the growth process. And if that in turn happens, then there's no future for the finance sector, because the finance sector ultimately the original idea of banks and so on would lend money to companies, which would then use that money to invest in production processes or in oil or coal extraction processes, and they would then share the profitability. But if there is no profitability anymore, there's nothing any longer to share, and that's the sort of situation that we're at. I mean, that's what I see you as describing, essentially. There is no long-term future for the finance sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's the saying the neoliberals had, which is, I think, a design flaw in neoliberal practice, was they had this saying about that a rising tide floats all of the boats. So you had this idea that it didn't matter that the very rich were getting very richer as long as everybody's income was going up. And that was the theory. So that, you know, if governments stood back and got out of the way of the free market, then we could let it rip. It would be a new age of prosperity. Everyone would be better off. That largely was based on, and it's a kind of magical period in human history, between 1953 and 1973, so just 20 years. We produced more wealth in those 20 years than we produced in the 150 years prior to them. You had a massive explosion of trade around the world. I mean, it's where globalization starts. In that period, you have the economies of Europe and of Japan and Korea shifting from being coal-based economies to being oil-based economies. There's massive development. And what it corresponds to is the exponential growth of oil extraction. And why it ends in 1973 is that's the point where extraction ceases growing exponentially. The problem with it, so that was almost the period that everyone in economics regarded as normal. That any crisis that we've been in a sense, the normal that we're supposed to be trying to get back to is that explosion of growth. Seen from an energy point of view, you can't ever have that again. I mean, unless you're going to find a new energy source.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, that's the period when I did my training in economics, finished my training in economics. And as you said, I mean, the rising tide floats all boats. What about the falling tide?
Well, therein is the problem that we find ourselves in now, because in a sense, the reason that people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Elon Musk are these sort of godzillionaire figures that have more money than anyone could dream of, in the end, is because of the amount of energy that we released into the economy. That had we not had that energy, I mean, yes, there were divisions between rich and poor in the past, but never that wide. And it was only possible because of that energy. Problem now, as the energy going into the economy depletes with every passing year, is that has to resolve. And the problem then is if you like, the design feature of neoliberalism is that we provide money to the people at the top while cutting the supply to the people at the bottom. So if you look at the kind of goods that we look at for where is the inflation, basically, if you're eating out of a food bank, you're not about to buy electronic goods. You're unlikely to buy a new smartphone or an iPad. That isn't going to happen because all of your income is going just to keep you alive. We have this growth of what Guy Standing calls the precariat. I mean, more and more people falling into this sort of poverty trap. They cannot consume beyond that kind of day-to-day essentials. But the problem they face is the day-to-day essentials are going up in price. I mean, I noticed, was it this week or last week, they were talking about putting up gas prices. Again, they waited until there was some bad news over the pandemic to slip that one in, so it wasn't picked up that widely. But of course, that's going to disproportionately affect poorer people compared to richer people. So again, that if you like, another layer up the income ladder has now been pushed down into the precariat. The other one I picked up this week is a lot of councils around the country are raising council tax to offset the additional costs that they're now faced with because of the pandemic. And again, that disproportionately affects the people at the bottom. So another layer gets pushed down into this precariat where all you're able to afford are the basics of human life. So that we have a sort of shrinking middle that's able to purchase the things that create inflation. According to the way we measure inflation, according to that measure, there are fewer and fewer people buying the kind of things that are in that measure of inflation. So it gives the impression that we have no inflation. Whereas the reality is you have inflation at the very bottom in terms of essentials. And again, nobody places taxes into the measure of inflation. That doesn't mean you don't have to pay them. Yes, again, if we threw taxes into the mix, we might say that actually we've been running a pretty high inflation rate.
So you get stagflation, though, isn't that the case? You get stagflation because when the people at the bottom are finding that the costs that they have to spend to get hold of essentials like foodstuffs are going up, and their taxes are going up, and all the rest of it, and they have even less, then there is no discretionary expenditure left. So they don't go into places they ever did, like Debenhams or all these shops, which then close down. And that closure of these shops is a stagflationary process, the stag being stagnation or decline, which I think is the key feature of an economy in decline. You get rising prices and you get the decline in jobs and companies going bust and so on.
Yes, I mean, then you get, in a sense, it exposes a weakness in this idea that we mustn't give people money because that will cause inflation. Because actually, a lot of the people you'd be giving money to in the way that's proposed will actually spend it more on essential things. And one of the essentials that's in there is the huge mountain of debt that we've got. There are tens of thousands of zombie companies and zombie households around the country now who basically have racked up huge debts that have no real way of paying them off. So that paradoxically, one of the reasons why inflation may not be happening across the board is because a lot of money, if you look at the velocity of money in the UK, it's less than 1. So effectively what it means is when somebody gets money...
Can you explain that for people?
Right, so the idea of the velocity is, basically, it isn't just the quantity of currency that you print into circulation. You need people to keep spending it. So the idea would be the more transactions you can make with a single unit of currency, the higher inflation would be driven eventually. At the moment, the circulation is lower than 1, which means basically I'm not even paying one person. I think the reason for that is because of this overhang of debt that everyone's got. So that instead of, if you like, when somebody gives you money, either you've done some work, whatever, you get some money in, instead of buying something with it, you pay debt off with it. And because currency is created as debt, when you pay off debt, it destroys currency. So effectively that sort of pound or dollar or euro that you pay back to the bank doesn't then lend that to somebody else. It just destroys it from the system.
Can we try and wrap this up with some remarks and discussion, a little bit of discussion about what are the appropriate policies and things to do in these circumstances? Because you've got an economy in decline and at the bottom, people becoming desperately poor. And what's the solution? If we're looking for a solution which is going to be some kind of communist panacea, I think that's naive. But there does need to be some policy and some approaches which are going to rescue or bail out the people at the bottom, at the very, very least, and also which are going to have some effect on the structure of the economy in terms of what it actually produces, where to replace the economy that's beginning to fall to bits.
Yeah, I mean, there are...
question for you.
Okay, but there are a whole series of things that people will talk about doing. So you have Klaus Schwab and his Great Reset. I mean, one of the questions I've heard somebody ask recently is, what's the matter with a reset? Surely that's a good idea. I think what's wrong with it is the kind of people that would be in charge. Because for his other sins, Klaus Schwab is also the guy that wrote the book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is as close to an adult fairy tale as you will ever get. Because it is about how we're going to create this miracle new electronic revolution without any energy to power it. What Schwab is talking about is the ability for me to sit in front of a computer and work digitally without any electricity in the computer. Well, good luck with that one, Klaus, because I've got news for you. It doesn't work. Computer without electricity is a work of art, but it ain't going to do you much good. So you need to have an approach that is grounded in the material reality that we're living in. So essentially, oil is depleting, coal has already depleted, gas will deplete by the end of the decade. The three of those between them still make up more than 80% of the energy that drives the economy. And when it comes to the big drivers of the economy, so shipping, air travel, and trucks, oil is the only game in town. Elon Musk has made his demonstration electric vehicle, and the batteries are so big that there isn't any room to put anything in the back of the lorry. So again, good luck with that one. Essentially that economy, that electric economy doesn't work without some new energy dense energy source, and thus far nobody has one. And think again that when I was a child, I remember seeing steam trains shunting sort of wagons back and forth at my local station. But that's in my lifetime that we were still making the transition from coal to oil. Energy transitions take a huge amount of time. We're talking multi-trillion-dollar investments. Even if somebody could magic up, something that's failed to ever put in an appearance sensibly, so nuclear fusion, or you just well have magic reindeer, magic rainbows, or even if somebody could create that in a laboratory, we're looking at decades down the road before you could ever roll that infrastructure out to replace oil. So essentially, any realistic model of a future economy has to be based on depleting energy. And that forces you to start thinking in terms of, let's separate out what we need from the things that we just want. So things like air travel, which we saw get slaughtered the moment the pandemic hit, that's unlikely to come back. Yes, there'll be people flying, but the idea that everybody gets to fly several times a year, forget it. Shipping, another area where we're seeing ships being scrapped at the moment, so they're just not going to be there. So we are going to be shipping far less stuff around the world. That tells you that you need to start focusing on how we move essential things. But for the rest of it, I think we have to be looking at a relocalization of economies. We need to be looking at things where, for the last, 40 years, we've been inculcated in this economy where you buy something, you use it, you throw it away. Quality isn't particularly an issue. Quantity is all that matters. So you get to buy T-shirts for less than £5. It doesn't matter if the T-shirt rips halfway through a year. You just go down to the local supermarket and buy a new one. That way of doing things is unsustainable. When we talked about an unsustainable future, that future is now. It was in the future, it's now here. So that we have to be looking at things like, if you're going to buy shoes, the old Russian saying that I'm too poor to buy cheap shoes. Essentially, if you're going to have a pair of shoes, you want a good, solid pair of shoes that are going to last, because that's all you're going to be able to afford. And you need somebody making those shoes locally. That the idea that we can keep offshoring everything to South Asia, that has gone. So we have a less materialistic, localized economy, crucially not one that can support the levels of income inequality that we have had. So one way or another, those income inequalities are going to disappear. The one way is that you have a massive crash in asset prices. Whatever Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, all of these people claim to have, there's no way they could ever spend even a fraction of it. So the moment, if you like, the moment people try to liquidate the value locked up in shares and bonds and all the rest of it, the moment people head for the exits, the price crashes to the floor. And that's the end of all of that theoretical wealth. So that's one way we could do it. The other way we could do it, which is probably the more manageable, would be to go back to the days where governments actually taxed that kind of wealth and redistributed it. And that may be inflationary, but at least it's sharing the inflation across the entire population. So that essentially, as long as people at the bottom are seeing their incomes going up, one of the benefits of that is it writes off all of the outstanding debt. But again, if you like, you have the scenes that we saw in America over the week, during the week. That may just be the first rumblings of something far more ugly in the event. And I certainly don't see anything in the Biden administration that says that they're going to tackle these or even be aware of these inequalities. So the fact that they brought in the guys from Wall Street to run the economy, the guy from Monsanto to do the environment, and the guy from Raytheon to do foreign policy tells you all you need to know about what that administration is going to be like. Whatever promises they made in the run-up to the election, they're not going to deliver. So those kind of inequality, the rumbling of discontent over that is going to continue. And as we've seen, keeping a lid on it may become more and more difficult. So that's another way that it could play out, is this sort of disintegration into, sort of tribes that hate each other. And it's almost because of this lack of awareness that the actual driver, the thing that's making everyone miserable, is that the amount of energy going into the economy is depleting with every passing month. Once you see that,
and COVID-19 is making people miserable, but I think to begin to draw it to a close, I'd just add to that this point about food. When it comes to if place is getting poorer and you go down the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basically the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is just getting enough to eat and having somewhere to live that is dry and warm, and that I think is quite fundamental. That in the future, the in the near future, the economic activity which is going to be most meaningful for most people is growing food and making sure their houses are.
Maintenance becomes a big issue as well. It's
exactly. Maintenance, repair, those kind of things, and the development of those skills for maintenance and repair. And
but again, that's one that not even the energy people factor into. So people talk about a net energy cliff, where as the amount of energy we get back for the energy we invest drops away, people think of that cliff going that way. There's also a maintenance curve that rises at the same time.
Yeah.
Because we have to invest more and more energy in keeping the things that we've got running, because we become increasingly aware that there isn't a replacement. So if the cars that are currently being shipped from China or wherever around the world and arriving on our shores aren't going to be there anymore, then we will cannibalize the vehicles that we've now got to keep at least some vehicles running.
To the extent there's any petrol